So in this video, in this chapter, we're gonna talk about interest rates. They are incredibly important. As we talked about in chapter one and in chapter two, uh, we said that a modern financial system was critical to a developed economy being able to exist. And in any financial market, a financial market itself can't exist unless there are individuals that can save money and that there are individuals who need to borrow money. Well, that market for borrowing money and saving money has a price attached to it, and that would be the interest rate. And we can draw that kind of very quick. Um, let's see. Right, we can kind of draw that very quick. Where we have our interest rate here, we have our quantity of money here, right? And we just look at the people that are borrowing money and the people that are saving money, right? Borrowers would be demanding money, savers would be supplying the money. And we can kind of see in that very simple description that you would have looked at in like in 202, just that kind of principles class where we just said, okay, yeah, the intersection of the two gives us the interest rate. It's a bit more complicated, fortunately, than just this kind of simple demand and supply graph. But at its very essence, it is a demand and supply graph. But we want to go through some of the necessary calculations that are done when we look at how interest rates changing then change the rest of the banking system and market. And obviously, that's quite topical right now as I make this lecture here in April of 2024, because we're now, I don't know, what, 2 years into dramatically higher interest rates than we had in the past. How much higher? Well, we can, if we look at the St. Louis Fed, and we get a sense of interest rates here, and we look at it from the federal funds effective rate, well, we can see that again, when we say that the Federal Reserve has changed interest rates, we're typically talking about the federal funds rate, and we can see that the federal funds rate effective rate, the target, has been in a series of stepwise increase since 2022, and that we've now been in a nearly year-long constant rate of just over 5%. The markets were generally anticipating at the beginning of this year, January of 2024, that the Federal Reserve was going to start to reduce interest rates, but it has not. And if you're asking me what my opinion is, whether or not, I don't think it's going to change at all for the rest of 2024. But how did we get here? Well, let's just expand this out. And I'm just kind of motivating our discussion here. So look what happened here, right? We raised interest rates eventually by 2016 because the economy was doing very, very well, right? And we raised interest rates to kind of slow the economy down. Some would say we didn't raise them soon enough. Then COVID happened, and we had to stimulate the economy massively. Look at that, right? Between February and March, all the progress that had been built up over nearly 4 years eliminated in 1 month. But it made this gray region, which is the area then defined as our recession, very narrow. Just the barest of, probably, I don't quote me on this, but probably one of the shortest recessions in U.S. economic history. And then we see interest rates, then some would argue, kept too low for too long, then causing much higher inflation rates that then suddenly recognized, or eventually recognized, that the only way you can get rid of that is by raising interest rates. Why do we say that's the only way you can do it? Because let's look at the example we have in the past, where we had incredibly high inflation at the end of the 1970s. And the only thing you could do was Paul Volcker. Look at that. That's an interest rate of 10.54% in June of 79. That's, I mean, I just kind of randomly went to this date, but June of 79 was when my father, um, who had just gotten out of the, or no, he was still in the U.S. Army, and he got a VA loan, which is supposed to be a pretty inexpensive loan because you've got the Veterans Affairs, you've got the you got Veterans Affairs, the U.S. government backing your loan, and he told me that he had an interest rate, a mortgage interest rate of like 13%. Was he a bad credit risk? No, right? It's just that even when the federal government's borrowing money, it was paying in June of 79, 10.5%. So of course his rate was going to be a little bit higher than that. But look at that. You need to look at what happens here. You need to throw the economy into a recession, a severe recession, which is what we entered in 1981, 1982. And look at that. That's where we get this pretty severe recession here. Causes Jimmy Carter to lose. I guess that would be the recession that's right here. And then the Reagan administration has to deal with a rather severe recession in 1982. You can only do that because you reach a peak of interest rates here of, what is that? 22% in December of 1980. Look at that. How can you even exist? In terms of borrowing money, who would want to borrow money at 22%? Not too many. Now, the question would be how did we get there? Some would argue, and this would be back to our optional reading from week 1 and 2, was that Arthur Burns kept the interest rate too low in the late 60s, early 70s for political reasons. And that got us into a bad situation. Okay, so I've been talking now for 7 minutes and not even getting into the lecture, but it should be pretty obvious here that interest rates play a critical role in economists being able to preach or to believe that they can manage an economy. This would be kind of like if we were imagining marionettes or whatever, right? Those like little dancing things, on a stage. This would be the strings that we're pulling to make the little marionettes look like they're dancing. That's how economists perceive interest rates here. Okay, so here's our learning objectives. Throughout this chapter here, we're going to be looking at, how to calculate present values and future values, and you'll be doing those in the homework assignment too, so you'll have some exposure to that. We're going to look at different debt instruments that exist, and we'll just kind of basically get a better understanding of some of the mathematics behind interest rates themselves. So that in the next chapter, we can look at it a little bit more as it applies more to the economy as a whole. Okay, so when we think of how interest rates are determined, probably the one thing we look at would be who has to pay the least to borrow money, who poses the least risk of defaulting, and that would be the U.S. government, right? So we could look on Treasury Direct, that sort of primary market that we talked about in the previous 2 weeks. We could look at how what rate does the government get to borrow at, and it generally would be your kind of floor interest rate. All other interest rates then are going to be somewhat higher from that. And one of the concerns in 2020 was that that these treasury bonds had a bit of an interest rate risk as opposed to a default risk. So the default risk is practically zero because the government has the power to tax the population. It can practically never go into default. You always get people that will say it can, but it pretty much can't. But so then why don't people just automatically invest then in this safest investment because the default risk is zero, meaning you have basically a zero chance of losing your money. And the reason why is because of this interest rate risk. This risk that the bond prices themselves are not going to change in response to market interest rates. Why is that? The reason why, right, in 2020 was that with COVID, everyone was kind of taking they were preferring to take all risk off because they could even be expecting that big companies like, let's say, Coca-Cola or McDonald's or a really big corporation, even that kind of company during COVID could fail when in any other normal situation it wouldn't. So it would mean that investors and financial advisors here were thinking that savers were going to irrationally invest in treasury bonds because they were just so scared of everything else. We could think back to the 2008, 2009 financial crisis as another time when that would have happened. But the worry then is that as interest rates go up, some people might not buy those other investments, even though they would pay more, and that the government would know this, and that the government auctions of bonds would reflect this. And it would reflect the fact that treasury bonds have, in some sense, a premium because they have no default risk. They're not going to adjust as quickly to interest rate changes. And related to that, the other part of the interest rate risk here would be then at how these interest rates would adjust based on future inflation expectations. We would expect that bonds, if they were offering a fixed interest rate, that those bonds would have a lower price in the future if we were expecting higher inflation. What if they didn't? What if the bond price didn't fall because either people thought that the inflation was going to be incredibly short-lived and it wasn't going to be long-lasting? Or if people continued to buy the bonds, even if the real rate of return, meaning after inflation, even if the real rate of return was less, because people just thought the risk is less. So you see here, what we're trying to do here in this slide is kind of counterpose these two risks that all investors, yourselves included, and myself included, have to kind of compare and contrast. Is this default risk with this interest rate risk? Typically, the safer investments, the ones that pose the least default risk, instead have a greater interest rate risk, where the bond prices don't adjust quickly enough to changes in the interest rates. Okay. So I'll skip kind of some pointless slides here, otherwise this lecture will take way too long. And I'm presuming, again, you can all kind of read slides here. And you'll notice too here, I'm kind of keeping it in this view intentionally because you could, if you want to here, you can kind of read these notes here. These are supposed to be notes that I'm reading to you. Like if I didn't know the material, I guess, and I was teaching this class for the first time, maybe I'd make myself look smart by like reading these things. Dude, if you want to read this, you can read this here. And if you can't see it on the slides that I'm uploading to Canvas, just let me know and I'll make them available to you to read. Okay, so what is what is an interest rate in general? Just kind of going back to what you would have learned in principles or possibly in some kind of like basic finance classes. Well, an interest rate is an opportunity cost. It's the opportunity cost of supplying money now, but not getting paid back until the future. And that interest rate has to basically include three components. It has to include the one that's, I would say, is the obvious one, which is there's a chance that the person might not pay it back, right? And so there is a small default risk. There is as well the fact that the money that I pay back in the future is going to be less valuable in the future because of inflation. So the interest rate should also reflect the fact, it should at least incorporate the fact that money becomes less valuable over time. And also, it should reflect, or the other thing that the interest rate should include is some degree of this opportunity cost, the fact that you would have to wait to do something. And so you should be compensated for that waiting activity. So we could think of any interest rate as the um, addition, basically, of these three things. Now, as a way to think about this, when I think of the I'll apologize already. I'm kind of going off on these tangents from time to time, but I think that the tangents really reinforce for you and for me. They reinforce how the reality of the world around us doesn't always reflect the theory of how this should exist. And one way that I see this is, for instance, when I got my mortgage from Navy Federal Credit Union. Um, uh, my interest rate was 2.875%. And when was that? 2020. So and it's a 30-year fixed. Now, I'm a PhD economist. I'm not a PhD in finance, but that rate, i even when it was presented to me, is just crazy. Um, why is it crazy? Because I don't see. Maybe it would accommodate for this. So I live in Hawaii, and if I were to default on my loan, the Navy Federal would be able to sell the house, but there would be certain costs, right? They'd have to hire a real estate agent. They'd have to throw all my junk out of the house. They'd have to, give me court proceedings, and all that costs money. And right, they'd be able to sell the house at least in my hot Hawaii real estate market, but still, right, it'd be a pain in the ass for them to have to sell, and there would be some cost, and that 2.875% should compensate them for that somewhat. Additionally, it probably is high enough combined to compensate for this opportunity cost. And the only way I can talk about that would be is right, there are people that are saving their money voluntarily, and let's say that they're getting, I don't know, 0.5%, which is probably even higher than it is, but let's say they're getting 0.5% to put their money in a savings account at Navy Federal. Well, that person, by voluntarily doing it, has indicated that it's going to cost, they would need to receive 0.5% of interest to delay gratification, to delay getting it until the future. Okay, so let's say the default risk is, let's say, 1%, and that's probably even pretty high. Let's say it's 1.5% here. Well, even if that's all the case, there's no way that the inflation rate over the next 30 years isn't going to be greater than a 1.3% on average annually. Meaning, even in 2020, when there wasn't any inflation, it didn't strike me that that situation would be able to go on for 30 years. And I could tell pretty quickly, even in 2020, that given that rate being locked in for 30 years um, with no resetting, there's no way it would be able to accommodate for what the inflation rate would be. Meaning, I don't know what inflation is going to be like next year. I have some good predictions, but they're certainly not going to be accurate. It's just going to be my best guess. So when, how do we how do other places deal with this? Um, Essentially, it's incredibly odd in the United States that we have 30-year mortgages. Almost every other country in the world has, including Canada, Western Europe, all have uh, interest rates for homes that adjust every few years. And so that was the big concern in England, for instance, most recently, where all the low interest rates were going to be adjusting to, triple what they were. We have them somewhat here in the United States, and that was part of the reason why we had the 2008, 2009 financial crisis was variable rate mortgages. But I mean, they're out there, but most people don't get variable rate mortgages. Most people just get a fixed rate mortgage. And so, um, mortgage rates are just incredibly low in the United States. Even when they're at 7%, as they are currently right now in April of 2024, it's actually still a little bit too low, considering the circumstances, primarily the inflation circumstances. It's actually still low, although the people paying it probably don't feel that way. Okay, so what then does the interest rate represent? It represents both this payment that you make for being able to have access to the money now, even though you don't have the money. But as we say that, then we can see that the interest rate then is essentially that price, that link, as the slide points out here, that link between the present and the future. I bought a house that cost over $1 million. I don't have $1 million. The only way I could get that $1 million was by paying an interest rate, enough to incentivize the bank to give me the $1 million now and then agree to pay it back in increments over 30 years. You say it like that, it makes me sound like I robbed the bank, I guess. Okay, so let's now start to talk about some of the maths that we would need to do here. Well, one of the key things we would need to start to be able to calculate is the future value. So let's start to think about these definitions here, because we're going to have a few definitions here over the next few slides. The future value, it's going to be the value that at some future point in time, based on an investment we're making today. Now, typically, it's not just for 1 year, though. So typically, we're talking about this interest being compounded over time. If we were to set up a kind of a very simple example here, let's just say that I borrowed $10,000 for 10 years. Let's just make my life simple here, at a 5% interest rate. So if we look at this right here, what we're solving for here is the future value. What is the future value of that $10,000 invested for 10 years at a 5% interest rate? Right? So the 5% interest rate is accumulating, compounding over time. Okay, well, then essentially what it would be is 10,000 times 1 plus 0.05, right? Because I'm going to represent the interest rate I as a decimal. And then I'm going to make this over 10 years, so it's going to be to the 10th power. That's going to equal my future value. So in your calculator, just to make you kind of comfortable with this, if I were just solving this on a simple non-graphing calculator, what I would do first is just put in the 1.05. And then if you look on your calculator, you'll see the little hat symbol, right? The kind of mark that looks like this. On my TI calculator, it's on the left-hand side, about in the middle of the row. So it would take 1.05 to the 10th power. And when I do that, it's just going to keep going on here. So I'm just going to keep it simple here. So if you're getting a number of about 1.628, you're pretty good. And so then I would multiply that by 10,000. And I get an answer of $16,288.95, rounded. And there's my future value. So that would be that if I invest $10,000 over 10 years, paying a 5% interest rate per year, that at the end of those 10 years, I will have an account balance of $16,288.95. Okay, so that's our future value. And they give us an example here, which again, we can solve here. We could solve this. So now to be able to choose which CD you would want, we would have to solve this, right? We would set this up as 1,000 times 1 plus 0.04 to the third. And then a second CD that's going to pay an interest rate of 8% the first year, 1% the second year, 1% the third year. So now, what we can see here is that you would actually have to solve this 3 times, because you would need to solve it for one where the interest rate, right, so you'd actually have to you'd have to do the summation of the 3 years. So you'd actually have 1,000 times 1.08. Then that answer, whatever that number is, whatever, let's just call this FV1. So then you would take FV1 times 1.01, and that would equal FV2. And then you would take FV2 times 1.01, because that would be the 1% for the third year. And that would equal FV3. These are all to the first power because it's only for 1 year. Right, but then you'd be comparing your FV3 here to whatever this number is here. And that would help you choose which CD you would buy. I can't see here. Obviously, I don't look at the slides before I start talking about them. So here we are here. Let's see if they solve it for us on the next slide. Ha, they do. Perfect. Excellent. Honestly, I don't. It's okay. This part, I think you and I can all agree about. This is the way we set it up, right? And so we shouldn't have any problems here. I like personally the way I set this up because it's a bit more intuitive, the process that we're working through. You'll get the same answer this way, but it might even be a little bit faster. But it's so easy to make a mistake here. I wouldn't do it that way if it were me. You'll still get the same answer though. Or you should. Okay, so that's our future value. Now, what about the present value? So we've got future value. Let's just remind ourselves here. Future value would be the future value of an investment made today. So again, I'm making the investment here in time period 0. Let's say it's a 5-year investment. What's the value of that investment 5 years from now, given a certain interest rate that I've been given? Present value, as the term somewhat implies here as well, the present value it kind of works in the opposite way here. It would be the present value would tell us how much I have to invest today in order to receive a certain value, to reach a certain future goal. So the present value, let's let's just call this PV, would essentially equal the future value divided by 1 plus I to the number of years. And so when do we see this? We actually see the present value determination being made a lot when you see like a lottery. Do you want to receive a certain amount today, or do you want to receive a certain flow of payments over the next 20 years that sum up to a certain amount? Let's just make our life easy here. So what if I presented to you, I'm just going to make up these numbers here. What if I gave you a choice? I'm going to pay you $2,000 today, or I'll pay you $2,200 1 year from now. And that the interest rate is 3%. So what do you want? Do you want $2,000 today, or do you want $2,200 1 year in the future? And that the prevailing interest rate is 3%. Well, to be able to make that choice for today, I need to compare the two present values. Well, the present value of 2,000 is 2,000. So we have to calculate this one because I'm not getting the $2,200 until 1 year from now. So that would be that the present value would equal $2,200 plus 1 plus 0.03 to the first, because I'm getting it 1 year from now. And if I put that in my calculator, that is 2130. I'm just kind of rounding here. 2135.92. Oh, that would mean that to be able to make it, that if I wanted to have $2,200 in the future, that I would need to receive today at least 2135 today to have the equivalent of 2,200 in the future. So what does that mean? Receiving $2,200 in the future has a present value of 2,135, and that's compared to the present value of $2,000 received today, which is $2,000. So essentially, receiving $2,000 today is less than receiving $2,200 in the future, because $2,200 in the future has a present value of 2,135. So that's given that interest rate, though, right? If we make that interest rate, if we change that interest rate, we change the present value. But you can see here how both of these calculations might have a different purpose for us. They might pose to us a different piece of information for us. Okay, I'm at 33 minutes here. I'm going slow. But most importantly, I hope it's making sense. Okay, so what we have to then do here when we're talking about these present values is that we have to engage in basically a discounting. So as it says here, discounting is the opposite of compounding. Remember, when we were talking about future values, we were compounding, because essentially we were saying, I receive $1,000 and a 4% interest rate for 5 years. So in the first year, I'm going to get 1.04. And then in the second year, it's going to be 4% on top of that, right, amount that was already increased by 4% the previous year, and so on and so forth. We need to do the opposite of that for discounting it, because now we need to discount it each and every year. And so what we would do, and you can see that in the equation, for our present value, is that we're taking the present value, that the present value is equal to the future value in year n over, so that's in the numerator, over 1 plus the interest rate to the nth power, the number of years that we're talking about. And that's going to compound it discount it for us properly. So what could we kind of conclude about this? And this is an important slide, at least for making sure that you understand what a discount, the discounting process consists of, is that the present value then would also then be known as the present discounted value. The longer we stretch it out, right? Because sometimes you get these lottery payments that are over 20 years or 30 years. Or think about someone like myself. I work for the state. I have a pension that's going to pay out to me over, right? Let's say I retire at 60 and I live to 85. That's 25 years. But the problem also is, right, we don't know how long I'm going to live, right? I could retire at 60 and die at 61, or I could retire at 60 and live to 105. So it's actually pretty difficult. Actuarial tables kind of can help us predict how long I'll live, but they're not going to be perfect, and it's only going to work if there's a large number of retirees. But what it also has to presume, right, when the state pension board has to determine how much to pay me, they have to make an assumption. What assumption are they going to use? They have to make an assumption about the interest rate, which they are not also going to know what it is. Let's actually just look. I'm actually curious here. So my system is called the ERS, Employee Retirement System. I've actually never looked this up, so give me a moment here. Here we go, over here. It's okay, it's a little bit old, but it's not entirely that old. This is their actuarial valuation report, meaning people predicting, and this is actually not for my pension, this would be for my lifetime health care. But in this report, they're going to make a summary, or they're going to make an assumption about a discount rate. It looks like they're making a discount rate of 7%. Okay, right? So now, if that discount rate were to change, if this is an overly high or overly low discount rate, it can lead to either payments that are way too high or way too low, right? And so we could kind of look at, let's see here, if they should say something about, yeah, look at that. It's crazy, but yeah. But look at what they need to do then, right? So they need to take their current obligations as they see it, right? And their future obligations that they're trying to predict, right? And that's key for them because they need to make sure that they have enough assets to cover future obligations. Let me repeat that again. Do we have enough money now to meet our future obligations? How would they do that? Well, they would have to invest it, right? They would invest the money that they're collecting from me right now as an employee, put that out into the market, get a rate of return to be able to meet future obligations. And what they're presuming here, as you read this number here, is that they're saying that if they can have the investments growing by 7% a year, year after year, geez, oh God, it's really underfunded. I live in the city and county of Honolulu. That even at a 7% discount rate, they're only 45% funded. Well, better only break half of my legs or break half of a hip when I'm old, because they can only have, even if they presume a discount rate of 7%, that the funded ratio is 45. Now, I know I'm going on about this a little bit longer, but what I'm trying to do is motivate for you why these discount rates are so important. What if, I was a politician and I said, God, that looks horrible. I don't want it to come out that, we're basically only half funded. I want you to, I would say to you, I want you to make a number look like I'm better funded. Make the discount rate higher. Just say, what if the discount rate is 15% or 14%? Let's just double it. 14%. My funded ratio will go up. When it's actually, right, my collections from my employees haven't changed. It's just that now I'm presuming I'm going to earn 14% in the market. Some might even look at that 7% and say, wow, that's really ambitious. I don't know how you could invest consistently like that and get an average rate of return of 7%. That seems really high. So, right, it's pretty important. And we use this in other areas too, right? The one that would apply to all of us would be the discount rate used by Social Security when you apply for Social Security earlier than your full retirement age. Um, and you can kind of see this discussion. I guess I can see this here too in Bing where they're talking about Bing. Okay, let's go back to the slides here. And you can kind of just see, I don't want to spend too long on this because I've just basically highlighted my point here. But you can see here then that as the interest rate goes up, in this case, the present value of that payment, right, would go down. But right, if we then turn it the opposing way, right, that if the interest rate then is lower, then it's going to be, for that shorter period of time, it's going to be worth more. So again, it all comes down to not artificial, I shouldn't say artificially, but making a presumption of our present value and future value based on a presumed interest rate. Again, present value and the discounting is going to be the opposite of the compounding and the future value. So whereas I was showing you here future values by talking about the higher I make the interest rate, that the future value is going to be higher, right? Because in a situation like a pension or lifetime health care, you're talking about, do I have enough value now to meet the future value, right? The opposite would be true here, right? That in the present value, that the higher the interest rate, the present value is then lower. I guess presumably we would do this also then for college, right? Not that you would actually make these kinds of calculations here, but again, you could do these calculations of how much, right? Because you're told in high school and all this time, like, the longer you work, or sorry, the more education you get, the more you will earn, which is true. The question though would be are you earning enough compared to the investment you've made in that education and what you could have done with that money otherwise? Well, we can calculate it. Again, I'm worried about time here, so let me just. Right, so we see these numbers here, and then I'll talk about the math here involved here. But essentially, what we would do is take each of those years, the 7,200 in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, and then we would use the interest rate, the 5% interest rate in each of the years. Again, you could set it up. You could set it up the books way, and it's a little bit faster. If you're comfortable with that, that's fine. Otherwise, you could set it up like I did over sorry, like I did over here, right? Where you could just determine the amount in year 1, then in year 2, year 3, year 4. Except now we're obviously solving for present value instead of future value. And we can see that the present value of that money that you received in the future is $25,699. So it would be one way of thinking about, this money, which adds up to what, 28, $29,000, right? $29,000 received in the future has a present value of $25,699. Does that make sense, right? Fortunately and unfortunately, people don't make the decision of whether or not to go to college based only on the calculation of a present value. Why is this useful? Why do we need to do this? Because until we do that discounting process, you can't really compare the value of financial assets to each other, and whether something makes sense to do now or to delay it in the future. That discounting process that we do helps us determine the value or the price of these financial assets. Because, for instance, in the 2008-2009 crisis, I bought a bond for Philadelphia School District. I lived in Pennsylvania at the time. I made a 30-year bond. I bought it in 2008. I still hold it. So it's going to be paying me out until 2038. I bought it at somewhat of a discount. And, in some sense, I had to make an investment in a rather uncertain time of October of 2008 of whether that made sense or not. It did at the time, not as certain now, but, the future is unknowable. So at this point, I've almost fulfilled my 30-year obligation. Yeah, I could sell it, but interest rates are obviously a lot higher now than they were in the past. And so most of the time we're doing this with debt instruments. You could do this discounting process with equities, which typically pay dividends, and you could find the discounted value of those dividends. But dividends are less reliable, right? Because they can change over time, and you're not entirely sure, whether you're going to get that value back or not over time. So let's focus our attention, instead of looking at equity, let's focus our attention on debt instruments. So let's look at simple bonds, discount bonds, coupon bonds, and fixed payment loans. So these would be kind of 4 types of debt that many of us actually kind of encounter in our simple life. Let's start with the simple loan. As the title says, it's a pretty simplistic instrument. Essentially, I borrow money and I agree to pay it at some future point in time with interest. Right? So if I borrow $10,000 today and I say I'll pay it back 1 year from now, and there's a 10% interest rate, it would simply be 10,000 plus the interest rate that would be charged to me over time, which would be 10,000 times 0.1, or essentially $11,000. Or, again, the other way you could just calculate this out here would just be that it would be 10,000 times 1.1. Pretty simple, right? 1 year, simple interest rate. Now, let's talk about a discount bond. A discount bond is where the borrower is going to pay back the amount of the loan only once, and they're going to do it when the bond finally matures. But they're going to pay me less than they're going to pay me less than the face of the value of the bond, meaning that essentially there is no, well, there is an interest rate, but what I'm being paid is not an interest payment. Rather, the interest payment is incorporated into a discount of what I'll pay right now. So I pay a lower amount now, and then it's agreed that I'll get $10,000 1 year from now. So what we want to calculate is, what is that discount bond's value? Not its face value, because the face value would be, right, if you were to print out a certificate that says the bond, it would say 1 year from now, Philadelphia School District will pay Tom Scheiting $10,000. The question would be, if the interest rate is 10%, how much should Tom Scheiting give to the school district to get that promise of $10,000 a year from now? Well, in essence, right, we would need to incorporate the fact that, right, we need to incorporate the fact that $10,000 received in the future, that the future value equals $10,000. And what do I need to find? I need to find the present value. And that's what we would solve for here. Now, in this case here, with this example they gave us here, they told us, if they told us how much the discount bond price was in year one, we could backwards calculate what the interest rate is. And that's what they did here with this math here. But you could also be told the interest rate and the face value, and with the present values, calculate that initial amount. Then we've got our coupon bonds. So coupon bonds are actually pretty familiar. This Philadelphia School District bond I have is a coupon bond. I also have a bond that I own from the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, that I bought in 2012. Non-callable bond that will pay out until the 2030s, something like that. And it pays 5% a year, right? So I think it was like a $10,000 bond. So it was a $10,000 face value bond. It's going to be paying me both the coupon and the coupon rate. It's a 5% bond, so 5% of that 10,000, that would be the amount of my coupon. But the rate would just be what we would commonly refer to as the interest rate. It's a 5% bond. And we could calculate the yield from that. All right, its structure then looks like this, right? Is that is that, let's say I bought a bond from IBM and I gave them $1,000. So they get that $1,000 from me in year zero. Then they're going to pay me $50 interest, year one, year two, year three, all the way until the end of year 30, right? And then in year 30, I'll have those 30 years of payments of $50, and I'll get my original $1,000 back. And we could basically sum that all up to know how much we would get with that structure of a coupon bond. And then we have our fixed payment loan. In the fixed payment loan, you essentially are, and this would be the way that mortgages, for instance, are structured, right? Every month in my traditional mortgage, I am, since I only did get my mortgage 4 years ago, I'm actually paying more in interest than I am in principal. But each month I'm paying, what am I paying? $5,500 a month. And that $5,500 a month mortgage is split up into two components. One smaller component of which is the paying off some of the principal, and then a larger amount which is paying off the interest. Right, by about year 10, I'll be paying a little bit more off on the principal than I am on interest. And by year 25, I'm paying off mostly principal and not very much interest because the loan value is much lower. And I guess I should say too, many of your student loans are also structured this way as well. And you kind of can see this, but I'm really taking too long here to talk about this. You can look at this. I just care more that you're understanding the theory of what I'm talking about. Okay. I'll make this video into two parts here. I'll stop the video here, and then that way we'll make this into two parts. It's probably the best because we're at about an hour right here.